Last week, I sat down with Xiangyu Ma, a PhD student in sociology at the University of Chicago, to talk about his new article in Poetics about the temporal dynamics of taste. So basically, this article is about how tastes change through time. But time isn't so simple as just looking at the calendar and watching time pass, although he does show how time affects tastes through the history. But also, he looks at how as you age through your own life cycle, as you grow from young to old, how do your tastes change? And then he also looks across generations about how tastes differ from baby boomers to millennials to Gen Xers. So there's three different dimensions of time moving here that affect how our tastes evolve. And there's some really interesting work here and even more interesting conversation. I'm very glad to be joined here by Xiangyu Ma from the University of Chicago. And we're going to talk about his new paper in Poetics on the temporal dynamics of taste. So I've got a couple questions for you, and I just want to start off by letting you, in your own words, tell us, what do you think is interesting about this paper?
So first, the most interesting, baby boomers are, according to the standard measure of cultural omnivorousness in the United States, the most omnivorous in their cultural taste. And this is true even after we account for differences across time periods and across age groups. So this is interesting, I think, for two reasons. So one is you can accept that this inference is true on its face. So there is something distinctive about the acculturation that the baby boomer generation went through that makes them more omnivorous than other generations. And the second is you can wonder if something else might be going on. It's not just about the baby boomers. Maybe the measure, something's going on there.
Well, that's a perfect segue into my next question, because this sort of measure of cultural taste, the sort of index of cultural taste idea fascinates me. But I love a paper that comes down not just in saying you need to account for more than just time and age, and you have to also worry about all three, time, age, and generation. But I really like the idea of a cultural taste index and the possibility that it might be impossible, in that how you define the cultural taste index depends on sort of how you benchmark it and what you define into this. So I want to know if you have other things you could say about the hope for coming up with a cultural taste index. Is it possible? What can we do with this?
Yeah, I find this idea really fascinating too. So, that's that old saying, right? That if you want to measure change, then you can't change the measure. And there's obviously a lot of truth to this. But what happens, when when the measure itself is susceptible to endogenous change? So in this paper, I use a standard measure of taste that scholars tend to use. I sum up a person's likes over these 10 genres of music that have been measured over the past decades, right? And I find that there's one risk, and that is, as Stan Leverson noted a long time ago, there are often these internal mechanisms that drive cultural change. And when it comes to this measure of omnivorousness, we can think of a few possible candidates. One is that the genres themselves change, because genres are social categories. And two, this cultural cartography of genres, the field itself changes. That is to say that the relative distances between genres might change in a way that's generationally specific. So the question of how we can do better, I think we definitely can and we should. It's such an interesting question, right? Because we do want to answer the question of how taste changes as we age, over periods and across generation. And it's what motivated this paper. I think the idea of some kind of a music genome project is really fascinating, where we try to measure these objective sonic features of music rather than rely on these types of fuzzy social categorizations. But one problem might be that the meaning of culture gets lost when you use these sonic features. And I think maybe another way might be to think of a defensible and systematic way of accounting for these endogenous changes, almost like building like a cultural bucket, the way we have one for the consumer price index, where we find a consistent and defensible way of adding things and taking things out over time.
Awesome. That's perfectly what I wanted to hear. It's fascinating, this idea of all of it. So I'm really glad that you mentioned, and it looks like you've got some work ahead of you to solve this problem. So I'm glad to hear it. So Xiangyu, the question I've got for you next, the last one is, what's next for you? Where are you planning on going next with your research?
So the next paper that I've been thinking or working on that has to do with taste I guess this is more of a sociological theory kind of paper. So this paper got me thinking about taste a lot, and I've become particularly interested in this idea of a meta taste. And And this comes from my own attempt to clarify what taste is. And so let me explain what I think a meta-taste is. So a meta-taste is a second order, self-referential type of taste. It's a person's taste over their taste, right? And to develop a thorough account of meta-taste, we have to first clarify what taste is. And I found this a lot less straightforward than it would seem, because taste, even though it's central to the sociology of culture, is a really elusive concept. There's so many definitions abound. And I've kind of come at this from a more pragmatic place. I've surveyed the empirical literature to see how other scholars have measured and operationalized taste. And I find that, generally speaking, there are like three distinct ways people tend to understand taste. One is as likes, two is as choices, and three as a type of evaluative capacity. If you look at something like Pierre Bourdieu's distinction, for example, you can see that Bourdieu thinks of taste in all three ways.
Yeah.
So from here, I built to this idea of a meta-taste, right? So if taste has these three broad dimensions, we can sort of fold them over each other to get meta-taste. So let me give you two examples. So suppose we fold likes over choices. So this means we can ask if someone likes their choices, right? This gives us a really obvious type of meta-taste that kind of corresponds to a person's satisfaction with their consumption choices. This is a meta-taste that is instantly recognizable, and every consumer survey asks for this, right? Now, suppose we fold choices over likes. Now we are asking how people choose what they like. And this gives us a type of meta-taste that corresponds to something like strategic affective preferences. So obviously, the formation of affective preferences is not always purposeful or strategic, but they can be. So take the culture industries, for example. In Ashley Mears' study of the fashion industry, she finds that all these new fashion producers very consciously try to align their affective responses to those of industry elites. And so for this paper, what I want to do is kind of explore this for every permutation of a taste type and to come up with like a family of meta-tastes.
Yeah, I love it. This is great. And from a really narrow notion of taste, as the economist in me would want to say, I think it's an interesting analog because, and maybe this is a Chicago way of thinking, but we have a lot of, in the cultural world, this notion of rational addiction or accumulating sort of capital in something that makes you a better aficionado or it strengthens your taste for something. But it begs the question of the meta taste about, well, why are you choosing what to get addicted into? How do you choose whether to pick opera or smoking or whatever? And, it reminds me of the time when a friend of mine said I should start watching the TV show Breaking Bad. And it had already ended by then. And I heard it was a good show, but I thought it went on for 5 or 6 seasons or something. I'm afraid of getting addicted to that because I might like it. And then I'm stuck I don't want to choose to like that. I'm going to choose not to like it and avoid it because I couldn't afford it. So it's very interesting. I'm excited to see what you come up with.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I'm going to let you go on that. Xiangyu, thank you for joining us and for this version of the digest and telling us about your research. It's been fantastic to meet you. Sure. I look forward to hearing more from you in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks for having me, Doug. It was really nice to meet you. Yeah. I hope to join you for a session or something.